Lines.
Welcome back. Welcome back to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM in Washington, D.C. We have with us now speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author of City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, Articles and Essays on Socialism. It's Caleb Maupin, live from New York. Good morning, Caleb, and welcome back to Fault Lines.
Good morning to you, to both of you, and glad to be here.
Caleb, you were talking, I saw a very interesting segment that you did the other day. I believe it was on RT, I'm not sure, where you were talking about masks, but not from the perspective of, we've got the pro-maskers and the anti, if there's such thing as a pro or anti-mask. I don't know. I think the whole thing is kind of ridiculous to me, people arguing about that. But regardless, you were talking about like the political positions of masks and some of the outcomes. Maybe you can fill us in on that, Caleb.
Sure. I mean, we've got some store owners around the country that are saying you're not allowed to wear a mask in their store. We've got the governors of states, begging the public not to shame people for wearing masks. And it's like,
No, wait, Caleb, let me stop, because I want to make sure I heard that right. I really literally do. You're saying that there are store owners who are not allowing people to wear masks? Is that what you meant to say? Because that's pretty shocking.
Put up signs in their stores, you will not wear a mask in our store. This has happened around the country. I mean, it shocks me that they would do that. But yes, I mean, it's taking on a political connotation. It's argued that that if you wear a mask, you are critical of the president. You are opposed to these lockdown protests. This is getting ridiculous, right? I mean, wearing a mask is a matter of public safety. It's a matter of public health. If somebody has a respiratory condition or they're older, they're going to wear a mask. Around the country, other folks might be taking it off. They feel like things are starting to cool down. But I mean, it's just a matter of public safety. It's not a political issue, but it's become politicized in this climate.
Wow.
Well, you bring out a good point, and that is that we just had one of our favorite guys, Stephen Linman from StephenLinman.org, and he was saying, "Look, I'm in my 80s. I have some health issues, of course, age-related health issues." He says, "When I go outside, I wear a mask." Here's a guy who is a part of the vulnerable demographic, and you're going to say to somebody who's 80-some years old, or whatever the case may be, who is part of a vulnerable demographic, no, you can't come in here and try to protect and safeguard your very own life. I think that's unconscionable, Caleb. Lee, you had something to say?
Well, no, I'll mention this, because I mentioned I had a divorce hearing yesterday, and I did it was on Zoom, right? I appeared on Zoom, but my wife and her attorney were there in person. Okay. And I'm not going to get into any details about the divorce hearing, but this was weird. I've got to say, when the Zoom camera came on, the first thing I saw was my wife and her attorney at the table both with mask on. And I will just say it's visually jarring, where when the first thing you don't expect, it looked like they were gagged, or, you know what I'm saying? It looked like one of those weird courtroom things where they were gagged, and it took me half a second to go, what was that? And then I went, oh, okay, that makes perfect sense to me. But it took a second. It is kind of jarring when you go out and you see everybody in masks. It's new, but get used to it. You see what I'm saying? I mean, I think it was jarring to me because I'm just not, like most people, not quite used to it. And the video came on, and there you go. But the other thing is, Caleb, is it possible that because I haven't seen this, is it possible that these store owners are concerned about bandits? Like, is it a safety concern for some of them that if somebody comes in with a mask? Because I don't know. Have you seen, Garland, is there a reason we can't make masks that are transparent? So I'm not suggesting this even, but I'm just saying, have you seen those? I can't recall seeing a transparent mask. Can you?
No.
Well,
Okay. So, yeah, Caleb, go ahead.
And until the pandemic, if you wore a mask into a bank, I think that was against the law. I think you could be arrested for doing that, right? If you showed up at the bank with a mask on, that was a violation because of robberies and such. But now that's tolerated. So, yeah, I mean, it shows that these things are all being politicized or depoliticized. I like your idea of a transparent mask. I wonder why no one's thought of that. That's interesting.
Yeah. And then you also said so there's some areas where your people are being not allowed in with a mask. And didn't you there wasn't there some video or something of people like harassing and yelling at people with over masks?
That was here in New York. Yeah, it was the opposite, right? Here in New York, somebody came into a store without a mask on, and everyone in the store began shouting, get out, go home, and basically, screaming at them and kicking them out of the store because they were not wearing a mask, and everyone in the store felt like that was a threat to their public health. And that shows the polarization of the country, where in some places people are told they're not welcome in the store if they do wear a mask. Here in New York, people are being chased out of the store if they don't wear a mask. I mean, this is polarization, red states and blue states, but it's the issue of public health. It's wearing a mask, for goodness sakes. It shouldn't be a political statement.
Well, Caleb, it's kind of like the hydrochloroquine stuff. There's a lot of things right now that a lot of so-called political conversations that are going on now that I quite frankly just absolutely avoid. For instance, hydrochloroquine. I don't know anything about it. Can barely pronounce it. Can't spell it. But here's what I can tell you. If you're a Trump supporter in America, you got to be pro-hydrochloroquine. If you hate Trump, then you're anti-hydrochloroquine. That everything in
That's
politics.
hydroxychloroquine, by the way, Garland.
There you go. But perfect example. Whatever it is. But everything now is viewed through not just through a political lens, but through a lens of pro-Trumpism or anti-Trumpism. In a way, to me, that's even worse than viewing it through a political lens. What do you think, Caleb?
Well, science isn't supposed to be political, but the sad thing is we all know that it always kind of has been, right? That when somebody puts a white robe on and announces, I'm a scientist, their political background doesn't disappear, their perspective doesn't disappear, the perspective of the foundation that's paying for their research doesn't disappear. And unfortunately, science has always been tainted by politics. And that's something the scientific community has struggled against. They realize this to some degree and tried to push back against that, but it's just a reality. But now, I mean, it's becoming very, very blatant. And there's just a lot of divisions among the elite over this pandemic and the lockdown and such. I mean, I've said from day one, look, Bezos and Amazon are making out like bandits. Walmart is happy to be open. Meanwhile, a lot of these, stores and companies that are not part of the club, like Hobby Lobby, big Trump supporters, that had to close down their stores, they're losing out. So there's a division. There's a division with the ultra rich and the big monopolies securing their monopoly, and a lot of wealthy business owners and even small business owners losing out. And there's a division of interest. One group wants to stay locked down as long as possible. The other group wants to open up as quickly as possible. They have a difference of views. I mean, it goes with the fracking companies, for example. The fracking companies, this killed them. I mean, the lack of demand, the oil price drop, it killed them. Whereas the four super major oil companies, they secured their monopoly. They saw this as an opportunity to have their competitors swept under the rug. So there are competing divisions, and it plays out. The Trump camp tends to be those lower level capitalists who got screwed, whereas the ultra rich they tend to oppose Donald Trump, and they're the ones that saw this as an opportunity to secure their already semi-monopoly. So that's the division, and it's played out. And yes, both sides wanted the science to say what was convenient for them.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I will say this though, when we talk about, because that's something that Aaron Matei started talking about a bit lately, and I'm glad to hear you talking about it, because that is a lot of times what we see is we think that some kind of an ideological conflict. It's elephants fighting. It's various factions of the elite who are fighting over everything. Basically, they're ripping everything that we have right out of our pockets, but they're basically like two pirates fighting over who gets the treasure that they've just stolen. And that's the way it comes across to me in so many instances, whether it's foreign policy or instances regarding the what's going on, the lockdown or stop the lockdown. Oftentimes it comes across to me, Caleb, as factions of the elite, pirates fighting over who gets the stolen goods. What are your thoughts on my evaluation of it, Caleb?
I think you're exactly right, and that there's a long-standing division in the United States, especially since the beginning of the Cold War, between the rich and the ultra-rich. Ultra-rich, they tend to favor soft power and CIA interventionism. The rich, the regular rich, they love the military-industrial complex and making lots of money off of weapons. And this division goes down. If you read old John Birch Society literature from the 50s, they're always ranting against the Rockefellers and saying the Rockefellers are communists. Well, the Rockefellers aren't communists, but there's a reason that the John Birch Society, made up of lower-level capitalists, kind of libertarian folks, there's a reason that they hated the Rockefellers and saw them as the enemy. And that this division between the rich and the ultra-rich kind of plays out in different ways. The ultra-rich are okay with having the government more involved because they know they'll get the government-controlled monopoly, and they know that they'll win out. And so they want the things to be more stable. They're thinking long-term in the interest of preserving the system, whereas the most of the wealthy just want to see their profits keep flowing in. And they believe that that the free market leads to the best option. Everyone could be rich like them if they just worked hard enough. They believe this free market stuff. So that's a division. It's a long-standing division. The Rockefeller family, the DuPonts, the Carnegies. You talk about these elite families that have been running the United States for so long. They tend to think more strategically. They tend to favor a more liberal or managerial model for organizing capitalism in the United States. It's the lower levels of capitalism, those fracking cowboys they call them, the military manufacturers, guys like that. They tend to really believe if we just had a free market, everything would be fine, and they want more competition because they don't like the fact that those elite entrenched families have so much power and influence.
Well, Caleb,
we've talked about Mikhail Khodorkovsky on the show a bunch before, and Khodorkovsky actually had a very interesting quote where he said Donald Trump is the head of the, I believe he called it the alt elite, the alternative elitist. And that's, I think, exactly what you're talking about. Trump is one of those lower level guys, whereas a guy like you talked about the Rockefellers historically, I think the sort of the example today would be a guy like George Soros, right? Soros obviously, clearly, provably funds a lot of groups on the left, However, Soros obviously, provably, is also a major, he makes money off of money. And he's in a lot of sense, a very pure capitalist. So you've got that contradiction of somebody who's funding things. And I think you're right. I think it's a sense, and Soros is clearly part of that mainstream elite group. And what I thought that was interesting, because Khodorkovsky has obviously hooked up with the Rothschild. The Rothschilds, I think, are the other modern example of that. Caleb, do you agree with me that?
I'd say Adelson too. You got to throw Adelson in there because Adelson's a big time player, particularly Middle East, and he's pro. He's the one that Adelson's pro. Sledgehammer war kind of guy.
Well, the reason I'm not throwing Adelson in is because, as a Republican, you would assume he is pro-capitalist. That makes that, in other words, there's at least what appears to be a logical consistency. I'm not saying Adelson's not a bad guy. I'm saying that the contradiction with a guy like Soros, for instance, is that he is a leftist funder. There's not a question. Organizationally, that's what he funds. However, he also is a capitalist. So that's why I'm saying the difference is. Caleb?
Well, Soros's history with activism goes back to the 80s when he was the primary funder of anti-communist protests and dissident elements all over Eastern Europe. I mean, he bankrolled people that were trying to bring down the Marxist-Leninist governments. And his funding of these dissident elements was done in coordination with American intelligence. I mean, it was about, bringing down the Berlin Wall, overthrowing the Eastern Bloc. But that wouldn't have worked if it had been done on a right-wing basis. If it had been, the USA is great, down with communism, bring, pure American capitalism to Eastern Europe. It was done on this kind of liberal basis, right? Democratic socialism. A lot of the people that marched to bring down socialism in the USSR and other places, they weren't marching for capitalism. They wanted more human rights and freedom, and they kind of got hoodwinked. They got manipulated, and that kind of liberal politics that came with it, coming from George Soros, was key in making it happen. They talk about the soft power and such, and there was an effort to make inroads, into the Soviet Union by the United States. There were big efforts to do that, and part of that was was, setting up this kind of liberal element, and having influence within the USSR and within Eastern Europe. The liberals and, they had a lot to do with pushing U.S. soft power and manipulation. And Soros was a big part of that, and his funding of activist groups was a big part of that. And part of that was,
Well, Caleb, hate to cut you off, but we're going to take a break. We're going to come right back with Caleb Maupin. We're going to talk about U.S. You can finish up with this, and then we'll go to U.S. foreign policy towards China. You're listening to the most disruptive radio show in the Milky Way galaxy. It's Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lines. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? If you're tired of a superficial and shallow reporting for the mainstream media, here's your alternative. Forget the spoon-fed sound bites from pundits who know so little about so much. We deal with real issues. War in the Middle East, the military-industrial complex, U.S.-Russian relations, the rise of China, austerity, mass migration, global warming, and social justice movements in the United States and around the world, and much more. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision-makers take from the boardroom of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for Chan speak and are heard loud and clear. 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM in Washington, D.C. We are talking to the one and only Caleb Maupin. He's a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author of City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, articles and essays on socialism. So finish what you were saying. You were talking about Soros and his role basically in working to basically fight against what would be, I guess socialism, communism, whatever the case it would be during the 80s and 90s. Caleb.
Well, it is just kind of ironic that he's generally referred to among right-wingers as a communist or a Marxist, because he was so key in rolling back Marxist and socialist governments across Eastern Europe. I guess that was my only point in response to Soros and the way he's portrayed. He's one of these liberal billionaires, right? And that kind of soft power manipulation was very effective during the Cold War.
Yeah, that's why I said when you brought up the Rockefellers, it occurs to me he's got the similar contradictions to what again, I understand when you see somebody, and in Soros's case, it's not just, I would say it's not just mainstream liberal groups. He is promoting progressive groups very clearly. I mean, you can see that with Black Lives Matter funding, his funding on criminal justice reform. We had the person who was the head of Open Society's criminal justice reform movement on the show, and she was an abolitionist. She's a person who believes we should get rid of prisons. And that's an extreme position. And again, I understand it, and I know about Angela Davis, Michelle Alexander, and I understand the position, although I don't agree with it. But it was interesting that he funds that. And so to me, that's what, when you brought up the Rockefellers, I agree. There's weird contradictions. At the end of the day, Soros has said very clearly he doesn't care about what the implications are. He's just trying to make money. That seems pretty capitalisty to me in that sense.
Here's where I go with that, Caleb. When we talk about neoconservatives, neoliberals, conservatives, liberals, left, right, etc., when you look at the globalist kind of people, when you look at whether it's Soros or Adelson or any of those, Singer, I mean, on and on you go with the numbers, so-called, we're convinced that they're on the right or left. Their ideology is neither right nor left. Their ideology is an ideology of power. It's an ideology of how can we continue to control. It's interesting, too. I do want to pivot to China a bit, because one of the things that we discuss when we talk about China is a centrally controlled economy, where there's a central power that controls the economy. I'm going to argue this. We got the same thing, only it's informal. We have a centrally controlled economy. It's controlled by BlackRock. Right now, if you look at Donald Trump, who he surrounds himself with, billionaires, the same people that George Bush, Bill Clinton, Obama, they all surrounded themselves with the same people. Now, Trump claims to be on the right. Obama claims to be on the left. They surround themselves with the exact same people. So I would argue we have a centrally controlled economy also, but it's centrally controlled by a bunch of powerful billionaires and oligarchs, as opposed to China, where it's centrally controlled by the government. By the government. So, but you know China better than me. What do you think of my evaluation of central control of economies?
I mean, in a way,
Caleb?
I mean, our economy is very centralized around making profits for a small group of people, and it's organized to make sure that those profits keep flowing into the hands of a few big billionaires, bankers, and monopolists. No question about it. I think that's a little bit different than having a state central plan in which the government is controlling the economy, and trying to stabilize for long-term growth. But I can see, yes, that centralization. It's kind of weird, back in the days of the trusts, when Teddy Roosevelt was trying to break up the trusts and such, you had some socialists who said, well, maybe the trusts aren't a bad thing because after the revolution, it'll be easier to nationalize them and put them under public control. And that was kind of a contradiction. Most of the progressives were for trust busting and anti-monopoly and antitrust legislation. So that was kind of a division that you could see. But when you talk about the confusions of the elite and such, I mean, let's remember that the Rockefellers were Republicans for a long time, but the Republican Party just wasn't going to have them in a lot of ways. The Rockefeller family, they also, right? I mean, they hired Margaret Sanger, who was a socialist activist in New York City, a far left activist, but they hired her to start the Birth Control League, which gave birth to Planned Parenthood. Margaret Sanger, she was an activist for birth control because she believed in women's rights primarily. However, it's pretty clear the Rockefellers supported her because they were Malthusians. They thought the poor people were having too many babies and that the problems of the world were caused by overpopulation. They were part of these Malthusian societies that said that, there's too many people in the world, and so they thought birth control was a way to reduce the human population. So there was a conflicting interest there, but a far left person was able to make an alliance with them. And let's also add that Margaret Sanger, she was far left. She was tied to anarchist and socialist groups. But when the Soviet Union happened, when the Russian Revolution happened, and it didn't turn into the free love society that she wanted, it was more socially conservative. She really had no interest in supporting the Soviet Union. So she was much more open to Rockefeller Malthusianism.
And also racist, also blatantly racist and a eugenicist who started the Negro Project to try to convince black leaders to convince more black people to have abortions. That's part of her legacy too. We talked about that, even the people like Cynthia McKinney and stuff like that. It's the Margaret Sanger again. These, and I'll put it like this. I think, Caleb, you're probably the same way. I actually find, I'm not going to say the word nuanced. I'm going to say realistic. In other words, you're talking about the contradictions of a George Soros or a Margaret Sanger. To me, is more interesting, actually, than talking about these sort of stereotypical portrayals that we end up with a lot of these people. I actually find the details, and again, I can deal with the fact that people have contradictions. In other words, I don't need people to be all hero or all villain. People are complex, but I find that more. You as a journalist and as a writer as well, do you find those contradictions more interesting than the stereotypical portrayals, even if you don't agree with them? Because how could you? They're contradictions. Do you find that more interesting personally?
Oh, absolutely. And that it is a problem when people get too ideological and they're more committed to their ideology than actually understanding what's going on. It's a problem. I mean, we need to understand divisions among the elite and divisions among the ruling class in the United States and competitive interests when it comes to things like the lockdown protests and opening up or foreign policy strategies, et cetera. And if you just have it in your mind that, you're far right or you're far left and the left wing are the bad guys, the right wing are the bad guys, that's not enough, right? You're not really thinking with any depth there. You're just it's almost like a sporting event where you're cheering for your team. But actually understanding the world requires looking into who's who and what their interests are and why they're saying what they're saying. And that requires you to kind of understand whose interests are at play and have a more complex analysis.
Well, one of the things I did, since I do know you follow China, we only got a couple minutes left, but I did want to get your thoughts on what's going on with the Hong Kong, with Hong Kong right now and the U.S. policy towards China. My opinion is quite simple. If the state of New York was had a secessionist movement, and Chinese government officials were in New York City meeting with and funding with the secessionist leaders, it'd be a war. The U.S. would pretty much go to war with China, and that's exactly what's going on in the reverse. But what are your thoughts about the so-called secessionist movement in China and the U.S.'s involvement in Hong Kong? Personally, I just think it's none of our business. It's internal. Caleb.
The United States has so clearly been cheering for these elements in Hong Kong, and China has had enough of it. And they have understood that Hong Kong is part of China. It was returned to them. It's no longer a British protectorate, and they're saying, look, this ends now. That's kind of their attitude, is that this needs to stop. And that's all there is to it. It seems that China has tolerated for a long time, the United States backing, provocative activities in Hong Kong, and they're looking to bring that to an end. That seems to be the situation there.
It kind of reminds me, in a different way, of the Crimea thing, where the bottom line was, these were internal issues. They weren't in our part of the world. We'll tell someone, you can't interfere we've got the Monroe Doctrine, our part of the world, yet we're meddling in Taiwan, in Korea, in Ukraine. The U.S. basically says we have determined that we're the rulers of the world, and everyone must do what we say or be punished. And I just think it's starting to blow up in our faces, and eventually it's going to get worse and worse, Caleb. What are your thoughts? It just seems like we've decided we're the rulers of the world, and we can come to your backyard and tell you what to do, but you can't even come anywhere near us.
Indeed, into Crimea, and I'll tell you, I did not meet anyone in Crimea that felt that they were invaded or felt that that was not part of Russia. And it has been very economically beneficial for Crimea to democratically make the decision to join with Russia. There's a huge amount of investment, beautiful bridges, and all kinds of things have been built. It's a little peninsula that's all surrounding a Russian military base, and almost everyone who lives there is somehow tied with the Russian military base. That was the case long before going back to the Soviet Union. That it's always been the case. And in Crimea, what I saw was a group of people that were, they were technically in Ukraine, but they were all tied to Russia, and they voted and made a decision to join with Russia, and they're very happy they did it. But that's not what you would hear in Western media. In Western media, you hear a completely different story.
Right. Because as I understand, I've looked at the demographics. We're talking Crimea, a country that is out of 2.2 million people, 1.5 million of them are Russians, speak Russian ethnicity. And so I think you're right. I think certain countries, and China being one of them, have had enough, and they're acting, and they have a right to act.
We're out of time for the week, Garland. The week is over.
Oh my God.
Caleb Maupin, always great to have you on. Always a great discussion. Very, very interesting. Always stay safe there in New York as it starts to reopen. Garland, another great week of shows.
Oh my gosh, exciting, very exciting, great guest, and I'm looking forward. We got some people coming from RT. I think we got Rick Sanchez coming on next week. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, so we will be back next week with more. And again, I expect you agree with this. It's going to be a hectic weekend between Minneapolis and Trump's Twitter feed. It's going to be busy, I would say.
There'll be plenty.
Back. Yeah. Not a question about that. Anyway, everyone, thanks very much. Have a great week. Enjoy your weekend. And you've been listening to the best morning radio show in America. It's Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Ah, there's the music we were waiting for.